The day the HOA sent me a $10,000 fine for grass too tall was the same day I decided to turn my 20-acre property into the most impressive outdoor shooting range on the Texas border, just 800 feet from Karen's house, our HOA president. They didn't know I had a law degree and was a former Special Forces veteran. They also didn't know that this little ranch was the last legacy my grandfather left me, a man who fought for this country. I wasn't about to let some suit-wearing, self-appointed neighborhood representatives take this place from me. Where are you watching this video from? Drop a comment below if you've ever had trouble with your HOA. I promise this story will leave your jaw on the floor. I remember staring at that letter printed on cream-colored paper with the Lakeside Estates HOA letterhead, feeling my blood pressure rising with each word I read. $10,000 for grass that was maybe 2 inches over their arbitrary height requirement? This wasn't the first letter, but it was definitely the most outrageous. I'd received notices about my American flag being displayed inappropriately. It wasn't. About my truck being an eyesore. It wasn't. And about the small collection of military memorabilia visible from my front porch, apparently disturbing to the neighborhood aesthetic. Each violation came with increasingly hefty fines, but this one took the cake. I crumpled the paper and tossed it onto my kitchen counter, next to a pile of similar notices that had arrived over the past 3 months. Something didn't add up. I'd lived here for 5 years with minimal HOA interaction, and suddenly I was public enemy number 1. My grandfather had owned this land since the 1960s, long before Lakeside Estates sprouted up around it. The developers had somehow convinced him to incorporate the front 5 acres into their precious HOA, but the back 15 remained gloriously free of their jurisdiction, a fact I was increasingly grateful for. The knock on my door came around 7:00 p.m. that evening. Michael Chen, my neighbor from 2 properties over, stood on my porch looking nervous. "Mason, got a minute?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder as if worried about being seen. Michael was a math teacher at the local high school. Quiet and reserved, but we'd always been friendly. I invited him in, offered him a beer, which he declined, and waited as he gathered his thoughts. "I think you should know something," he finally said, his voice low. "At the last HOA meeting, when they thought most people had left, Victoria Harrington was talking about your property. She said, and I'm quoting here, 'We need to make living here so expensive for Caldwell that he has no choice but to sell.'" Michael looked up at me, his expression grim. "They're targeting you, Mason, and it's not just about community standards." That night, I dug through county records online looking for any information that might explain this sudden offensive. It didn't take long to find it. Harrington Estates, the development company owned by Victoria's husband Richard, had filed preliminary paperwork for a luxury resort development. The proposed location, right on the lake, encompassing several current properties, including mine. My land, with its unobstructed view of the lake and the mountains beyond, was prime real estate, and they wanted it badly enough to play dirty. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for the following evening. I hadn't attended one in years, but I ironed my best shirt, polished my combat boots to a mirror shine, and walked into that community center like I was walking into battle. Victoria Harrington sat at the center of the board table, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, designer glasses perched on her nose. She faltered mid-sentence when she saw me take a seat in the front row. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "What a pleasant surprise. We were just discussing the landscaping issues on Lakeview Drive." "I'm sure you were," I replied, matching her fake smile with one of my own. "Actually, I'd like to discuss the recent pattern of harassment disguised as HOA violations being directed at my property." A murmur went through the room. Most of these people were my neighbors. Some friends, some just familiar faces. They seemed surprised by my accusation, which told me Victoria had been keeping her vendetta relatively quiet. I laid out the timeline of violations, showing photos of my property that clearly contradicted many of the claimed infractions. I was building my case methodically, just as Elena, my old college friend turned property lawyer, had advised. Victoria's composure cracked when I mentioned the resort development. "That project is still in preliminary planning," she snapped. "It has nothing to do with HOA business." But the damage was done. I could see the realization dawning on several faces in the room. This wasn't about community standards. It was about forcing people out for profit. "Besides," Victoria continued, her voice taking on a condescending tone, "your property has become an eyesore. That military paraphernalia and that giant flag, it's not the aesthetic our community strives for. And frankly, given your background, some residents have expressed concerns about stability." There it was, the thinly veiled reference to my military service, the implication that I was somehow damaged or dangerous because I'd served my country. I felt a cold calm settle over me, the kind that used to come before a mission. "Mrs. Harrington," I said, evenly, "if you're questioning my stability because I served this country, I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." The room had gone deathly quiet. Victoria must have realized she had crossed the line because she backpedaled quickly, assuring everyone that she meant no disrespect to veteran, but the mask had slipped and everyone had seen what was underneath. As the meeting wrapped up, she approached me, her smile back in place but her eyes cold as ice. "If you can't pay the fines and comply with our regulations, we'll be forced to place a lien on your property, Mr. Caldwell. Nobody wants to live next to someone who can't maintain community standards." I leaned in close, keeping my voice low but firm. "You're misjudging who you're dealing with, Mrs. Harrington. I may not have your money, but I have something more valuable. I know the law." The flicker of uncertainty in her eyes gave me a grim satisfaction. As I walked home that night, my mind was already working through possibilities. They wanted to play financial warfare, fine, but they forgot one thing. I was trained to fight on all fronts. The next morning, I called Elena Rodriguez. We'd been close in college before life took us in different directions. Me to the military, her to law school. She specialized in property law now and had a reputation for fighting against corporate land grabs. "Mason Caldwell," she said when she picked up, her voice warm with surprise. "It's been, 3 years?" We caught up briefly before I explained my situation. There was a long pause after I finished. "Those bastards," she finally said, her voice hard with anger. "You know Harrington Estates pulled the same thing with my parents' farm when I was in law school. Different tactics, same endgame. I've been waiting for a chance to go up against them. When can you come to my office?" Elena's downtown office was small but efficient, her walls lined with law books and framed degrees. She listened intently as I showed her all the documentation I'd gathered, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. "Okay," she said, finally spreading a survey map across her desk. "Here's the good news. You're right about the HOA jurisdiction. Based on these original property records, only your front 5 acres fall within their authority. The rest is completely outside their reach." She tapped the map, her expression thoughtful. "And here's the interesting part. They actually modified the HOA boundaries 3 years ago in a way that incorporated more of your land than was in the original agreement your grandfather signed. That modification might not be legally binding, since it appears they didn't get proper consent from all affected property owners." Over the next week, Elena and I dug deeper. We found the HOA had quietly changed several bylaws over the years, each time making it easier to force out non-compliant residents. We found previous cases where Harrington Estates had used similar tactics to acquire prime properties. And most interestingly, we uncovered a financial scandal involving Victoria Harrington from a decade ago. Embezzlement charges that had mysteriously disappeared after key evidence went missing. "This is gold," Elena said, holding up the court documents. "Not directly relevant to your case, but it speaks to character. And if we need leverage, well..." She smiled, and I was reminded why we'd been friends. Elena didn't just know the law, she knew how to win. Sheriff Jake Thompson was my next stop. He'd been friends with my grandfather, and, while he maintained professional neutrality in community disputes, he was a straight shooter who valued truth. I found him at the local diner nursing a cup of coffee after his shift. He said, "Heard you're stirring up trouble with the Harringtons," as I slid into the booth across from him. His tone was neutral, but there was a twinkle in his eye. "Your granddad would be proud. He never did like how they moved in and started changing everything." We talked for nearly an hour. Jake couldn't officially take sides, but he shared some interesting insights about other residents who'd been pressured to sell, about noise complaints that had selectively enforced, and about Richard Harrington's connections with certain county officials. "Just be careful," he advised as we parted. "Victoria is the obvious threat, but Richard's the dangerous one. He plays the long game." Back home, I spread everything out on my dining room table. Maps, documents, notes from my conversations with Elena and Jake. The pattern was clear. The Harringtons wanted my land for their resort development, and they were using the HOA as their weapon, but they'd made a critical mistake in assuming I'd cave under pressure. I'd survived worse than some uptight HOA president with delusions of grandeur. As I studied the property maps again, an idea began to form. The back 15 acres of my property, the part outside HOA jurisdiction, bordered directly on Victoria and Richard's massive lakeside mansion. Their pristine backyard, with its infinity pool and manicured gardens, was less than a quarter-mile from my property line. And Texas law was very clear about what activities were permitted on private land in unincorporated areas. I made 3 calls that night. The first was to Elena, confirming the legality of what I was planning. The second was to my old Army buddy Ryan, who now ran a shooting range in Austin. And the third was to the county clerk's office, leaving a message about filing for a business permit first thing in the morning. Victoria thought she could drive me out with fines for tall grass. Let's see how she felt about the sound of gunfire at 8 a.m. every Sunday morning, just when she hosted her famous champagne brunches by the pool. The business permit application process was surprisingly straightforward. Caldwell Tactical Range, I wrote on the form, detailing plans for a moderately sized outdoor shooting facility focused on responsible gun ownership, veteran support, and community education. Because the land was outside city limits and zoned agricultural, there were minimal restrictions. I included detailed safety protocols, noise mitigation strategies, though purposefully not enough to completely eliminate the sound, and environmental protection measures. When the clerk raised an eyebrow at the location, I merely smiled and said, "Family land, been in our name for generations." While waiting for the permit approval, I didn't stay idle. I reached out to local veterans groups, offering free memberships in specialized programs. I contacted responsible gun owners clubs, pitching my range as a safe, properly managed alternative to the makeshift shooting spots in the desert. And I started clearing the land, marking out firing lanes and planning the infrastructure. All perfectly legal activities that coincidentally involved a fair amount of noise during daylight hours, especially when Ryan brought over some heavy equipment to help with the earth moving. It took exactly 3 days for Victoria to notice I was measuring out the main firing line when her Mercedes came screeching to a halt at the edge of my property. She emerged like a hurricane in designer clothes, her face flushed with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, teetering across the uneven ground in her impractical heels. I straightened up, wiping my hands on my jeans before answering. "Developing my property, Mrs. Harrington. Well outside HOA jurisdiction, I might add." Her eyes narrowed as she took in the partially cleared land, the stakes marking out what would clearly become shooting lanes. "You can't put a shooting range here," she sputtered. It's completely legal," I finished for her. "I've already filed all the necessary paperwork. Would you like to see the copies? My lawyer made sure everything's in order." The HOA emergency meeting called the following evening was packed. Word had spread quickly, and residents were curious, some concerned, others secretly amused by Victoria's obvious distress. This proposed facility, she was saying as I walked in, would create unacceptable noise levels and potentially dangerous conditions near our family homes. I waited until she'd finished her opening remarks before raising my hand. "If I may," I said, standing to address the room. "First, the range will be built to exceed all safety requirements. Second, it will operate only during reasonable hours. And third, it's worth noting that the property in question is not within HOA jurisdiction. I'm attending this meeting as a courtesy to my neighbors." A heated discussion followed. Some residents shared Victoria's concerns, while others, particularly those who'd also faced HOA pressure, were more supportive. Michael Chen spoke up unexpectedly, pointing out that the HOA had never objected to the Harringtons' late-night pool parties that often violated noise ordinances. Another neighbor, Sarah Williams, questioned why there was such opposition to a facility that could provide safety training for the community. Throughout it all, Victoria became increasingly flustered, especially when I calmly countered each objection with well-researched responses. By the meeting's end, the room was divided, but Victoria's absolute authority had been visibly shaken. The next day, Richard Harrington appeared at my door. Unlike his wife, he was calm, composed, and straight to the point. "Let's discuss this like businessmen," he said, settling into my living room with the ease of someone accustomed to getting his way. "I understand you're upset about the HOA notices. Perhaps we've been overzealous. I'm prepared to make those fines disappear," and he paused, studying me carefully, "to offer you twice the market value for your property. Cash deal, quick closing, no complications." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You could buy a much nicer place with all this," he gestured vaguely, "conflict." I let the silence stretch between us, watching him try to hide his impatience. Finally, I leaned forward. "Mr. Harrington, this land isn't just property to me. It's my grandfather's legacy. He taught me to stand up for what's mine, and that's exactly what I'm doing." Richard's smile tightened. "Be reasonable, Caldwell. You can't win against us. I have connections throughout the county." The threat was thinly veiled, but I'd faced down worse than a rich man used to getting his way. "And I have the law on my side," I replied evenly, "plus a growing list of your neighbors who are tired of being bullied by your wife and her rules." His expression darkened. "You'll regret this decision." As I showed him out, I couldn't help but add, "By the way, you're all invited to our grand opening. I'll be sure to send Victoria a special invitation." As Richard's car disappeared down the driveway, I felt a mix of satisfaction and trepidation. I'd just declared war on two of the most powerful people in the county. But as my grandfather used to say, sometimes you have to stand your ground, especially when, the odds seem stacked against you. The permit approval came through the following week, and construction began in earnest. Word spread throughout the community, and, surprisingly, offers of help started coming in. Veterans offering their expertise, neighbors with construction skills volunteering their time. What had started as my personal battle was evolving into something bigger. A stand against the unchecked power the Harringtons had wielded for too long. 3 weeks later, I mailed out the invitations. Pale pink cardstock with elegant cursive writing, exactly the kind of thing Victoria would use for her social gatherings. Inside was information about the Caldwell Tactical Range grand opening, with free demonstrations, safety classes, and a community barbecue. Each envelope also contained a small brochure detailing the sound specifications of various firearms, with particular emphasis on how far certain sounds could travel across open water. Like, for instance, a lake separating a shooting range from a mansion with an infinity pool. The date was set for the first Sunday of next month, precisely when Victoria's renowned champagne brunch would be taking place. I should have expected the Harringtons to fight back. 3 days after the invitations went out, a temporary barrier appeared at the entrance to my property. Construction barriers with official-looking "road closed for maintenance" signs. The county maintenance department seemed confused when I called. They had no scheduled work in the area. By afternoon, Sheriff Thompson had the barriers removed, citing lack of proper permits, but the message was clear: the Harringtons were mobilizing their resources. Next came the sudden review of my business permit. A county official called, explaining that due to community concerns, they needed to conduct additional safety inspections before my grand opening. When I pressed for details about these concerns, he became vague and uncomfortable. Elena made a few calls and discovered that Richard had golf buddies in the permit office. Classic delay tactic, she explained over coffee at her office. They can't legally deny your permit without cause, but they can slow-walk the process, hoping to derail your timeline. She tapped her pen against her legal pad, thinking, "We need to get ahead of their next move. Any idea what that might be?" I didn't have to wait long to find out. The local newspaper ran a prominent story about community concerns over that the reporter's wife worked for Harrington Estate. Michael texted me as soon as the paper hit driveways. Saw the hit piece, "Don't worry, people know it's BS." But later that day, he called with more troubling news. "Victoria cornered me in the school parking lot," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Said if I kept supporting your dangerous project, the school board might reconsider my contract. She's on the Education Foundation board, Mason. She could make trouble for me." The intimidation wasn't limited to Michael. Other supporters reported similar encounters, subtle threats about business permits, zoning issues, even tax audits. Victoria was leveraging every connection she had. And in a small county, those connections ran deep. It was time to change tactics. If the Harringtons wanted to play in the court of public opinion, I could play that game too. With Elena's help, I created a simple website, HOA Nightmare Stories, inviting residents to anonymously share their experiences with Lakeside Estates HOA. Within days, we had dozens of submissions, stories of selective enforcement, arbitrary fines, and bullying behavior. We didn't publish Victoria's name, but the patterns were clear to anyone who read the accounts. Meanwhile, I continued preparations for the range opening, now with additional safety measures that even the most thorough inspector couldn't fault. Ryan brought in his best instructors to help set up, all veterans with impeccable credentials. We worked through the inspection delays, documenting everything meticulously to prevent further interference. The community response was encouraging, despite the newspaper article. Interest in the range was growing, particularly among local law enforcement officers who'd been driving over an hour to the nearest decent facility. Victoria's next move was bold, even for her. At a special HOA meeting, she proposed a 300% increase in association fees for properties engaged in activities detrimental to community values. The definition of detrimental activities was conveniently vague and subject to board interpretation. It was a direct attack, designed to financially squeeze me while avoiding the legal issues of targeting my business directly. She clearly hadn't expected me to attend the meeting, much less come prepared. As she wrapped up her proposal, looking smugly confident, I raised my hand. "Before we vote, I think everyone should hear something," I said, pulling out my phone. I suspected Victoria might try something like this and had come prepared with a small audio device at the last regular meeting. Now I played back her candid comments to Richard after most people had left. "These middle-class nobodies don't understand quality. We need to push out the undesirables before they drag down property values." The room erupted. Victoria's face went from shocked to furious as her own words echoed through the community center. Several board members looked deeply uncomfortable, and residents were shouting questions and objections. In the chaos, I caught Michael's eye across the room. He gave me a slight nod of approval. The meeting dissolved without a vote on the fee increase, with Victoria storming out amid calls for her resignation. It was a significant victory, but I knew the war was far from over. The Harringtons had too much at stake to surrender over one embarrassing revelation. That night, as I was reviewing safety protocols for the range, Elena called with new information. "You need to see this," she said without preamble. "I've been digging into the Harrington estate's filings, and something doesn't add up. The environmental impact studies for their resort project, they're almost identical to reports filed for 3 other developments, just with the names changed. I think they're falsifying data to fast-track approvals." This was bigger than our HOA dispute. It pointed to systematic corruption. "Keep digging," I told her, "and be careful. Victoria is desperate now, and desperate people make dangerous enemies." As Victoria's support within the HOA crumbled, I couldn't help but reflect on the irony. She'd forgotten a basic rule of warfare. Never underestimate your enemy when you've backed them into a corner, especially when that enemy knows how to use both the law and guns. A.M. He hung up before I could respond. I immediately called Elena and Sheriff Thompson, letting them both know about the meeting. "Could be a trap, could be a genuine overture," Elena amused. "Either way, you shouldn't go alone." Thompson agreed to have a deputy coincidentally have breakfast at the diner while Elena would be in a booth nearby. Whatever Richard wanted, I'd be prepared. The diner was nearly empty when I arrived the next morning. Richard sat in a back booth, nursing a cup of coffee and looking like he hadn't slept well. As I slid into the seat across from him, he glanced around to ensure we weren't overheard. "Victoria doesn't know I'm here," he began without preamble, "and she can't find out." He looked older than his 56 years in the harsh fluorescent lighting, the strain of recent events evident in the lines of his face. "I want to make a deal, not for the company, for me personally." He pushed a folder across the table. Inside was documentation showing that Victoria had been forging signatures on HOA documents for years, including Richard's own. "She's out of control," he said quietly. "This resort project has become an obsession for her. But there's something you should know, the real reason she wants your land specifically." He leaned forward, lowering his voice further. "There's a pristine aquifer under your property. Water rights in this county are gold, Mason. The resort is just the public face. The real value is controlling that water source for future development." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. The aggressive tactics, the falsified environmental reports, Victoria's increasing desperation. This wasn't just about a luxury resort. It was about controlling a crucial resource in a water-stressed region. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, studying Richard's face for deception. He sighed heavily. "Self-preservation mostly. I've built my business over 30 years. Victoria's recklessness is going to bring everything down. I'd rather cut a deal now than face what's coming." He outlined his proposal. He would provide evidence of Victoria's illegal activities and testify, if necessary, in exchange for immunity from prosecution and a structured settlement that would allow him to salvage part of his business. "Victoria has been moving assets into her personal accounts for months," he added. "I need to protect what I can." As I left the diner, Elena fell into step beside me in the parking lot. "Well?" she asked, her expression concerned. I handed her the folder Richard had given me. "We've got them," I said simply. "But this just got a lot bigger than an HOA dispute." With Richard's evidence in hand, Elena suggested we needed to proceed strategically. "This isn't just about winning your battle anymore," she explained as we organized the documents in her office. "This is about systematic corruption that affects the entire community. We need to build an airtight case." Over the next few days, we worked corroborating Richard's claims with our own research and evidence from other affected residents. The picture that emerged was damning. Victoria had used the HOA as a personal enforcement arm, targeting properties she wanted for development while ignoring violations by allies. She'd manipulated bylaws, forged signatures, and used intimidation to silence opposition. And behind it all was the aquifer, a water source valuable enough to justify virtually any means of acquisition. While Elena built the legal case, I focused on the community aspect. The HOA Nightmare Stories website had evolved into a hub for residents sharing concerns about more than just HOA abuses. People were discussing water rights, development impact, and the future of the community they wanted to live in. Michael Chen had become an unlikely spokesman, organizing informal meetings where residents could speak freely without fear of Victoria's retribution. What had started as my personal stand against harassment was becoming a community movement for accountability and transparency. Victoria, meanwhile, was escalating her counterattacks. The local newspaper now regularly featured letters condemning the dangerous gun range threatening the community. Signs appeared in yards opposing the facility, and most concerning, supporters reported increasing intimidation. Everything from mysterious parking tickets to sudden tax reassessments. When Michael's tires were slashed in the school parking lot with no cameras capturing the incident, the message was clear. Victoria was getting desperate. Sheriff Thompson increased patrols around my property and the homes of key supporters, but he couldn't be everywhere. Be careful, he warned me. When people like Victoria start losing control, they can become unpredictable. Elena suggested we call a special community meeting to present our findings. Not an HOA meeting, she clarified, a town hall, open to everyone, including press from the neighboring counties. Make it too public for them to interfere with. We booked the high school auditorium, distributed flyers throughout the community, and sent special invitations to county officials, making it clear that attendance or conspicuous absence would be noted. The night before the meeting, I received a text from Richard. Victoria knows what's coming. She's destroyed documents. Be prepared for anything. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway outside. Victoria and Richard sat in the front row, she looking defiant, he uncomfortable but resigned. Elena had advised me to let her handle the legal presentation while I focused on the community impact, playing to our respective strengths. As the meeting began, I spoke briefly about how my personal dispute had uncovered broader issues affecting everyone in Lakeside Estates. This isn't about me anymore, I told the crowd. It's about who controls the future of our community. A select few acting in secret, or all of us working together transparently. Elena then methodically presented the evidence, using slides and documents to outline the pattern of manipulation and corruption. She explained the aquifer significance, the falsified environmental reports, and the illegal HOA actions. Every homeowner in Lakeside Estates has been affected by these violations, she concluded. The bylaws you thought protected your community have been weaponized against you, often illegally. Throughout the presentation, Victoria's expression shifted from contemptuous to alarmed as she realized the scope of what we'd uncovered. Richard sat stone-faced, staring straight ahead. When Elena opened the floor for questions, the dam broke. Residents who had been intimidated into silence for years finally spoke out, sharing their experiences with HOA harassment. Several county officials looked increasingly uncomfortable as connections to Harrington Estates were mentioned. Victoria attempted to dismiss the allegations as disgruntled homeowners exaggerating minor disagreements, but her credibility was shattered when Elena played the security footage of her threatening me on my porch. Seeing Victoria's unhinged behavior projected on the large screen, her carefully cultivated image of community leader replaced by a raging bully, was a turning point. Even her supporters looked shocked. Victoria finally snapped when Michael Chen detailed how she'd threatened his job for supporting me. "Of course I did," she shouted, rising from her seat. "People like you and Caldwell are destroying everything we've built. Do you think quality communities maintain themselves? Someone has to enforce standards. Someone has to protect property values from people who don't belong." The auditorium went completely silent as her words hung in the air. "And what people would those be, exactly?" I asked quietly into the microphone. Victoria's gaze locked with mine, her expression a mixture of hatred and fear as she realized what she'd done. "Veterans, teachers, people who actually built this community before you decided it wasn't exclusive enough?" A murmur rose from the crowd, swelling into vocal disapproval directed at Victoria. Victoria looked around the room, seemingly shocked to find herself suddenly cast as the villain. "You don't understand," she insisted, her voice rising in pitch. "This was all for the community's benefit. Property values, aesthetics." Richard placed a restraining hand on her, which she shook off violently. "Don't touch me! You've already betrayed me!" The accusation hung in the air, as Richard's face confirmed her suspicion. Victoria turned back to the crowd, her composure completely shattered. "Fine, you want to know the truth? That land has water. Water we need for development. Water that will make this community thrive. And I wasn't about to let some stubborn ex-soldier with his guns and flags stand in the way of progress." The admission silenced the room. Alana stepped forward. "Mrs. Harrington, are you confirming that you deliberately manipulated HOA regulations to force Midnight to remove Victoria from the HOA board and to establish a committee to review and revise all HOA regulations with proper input from residents?" Mikhail Chen was nominated to lead the reform committee, his quiet integrity exactly what was needed to rebuild trust. As people filed out of the auditorium, many stopped to thank me or to share their own stories of relief. Sheriff Thompson approached with a serious expression. "That was quite something," he said, "but it's not over. Victoria Harrington isn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. Watch your back." His warning proved prophetic. As I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this victory, while significant, was just another battle in an ongoing war. Victoria's parting words weren't just a tantrum of a defeated opponent. They were a promise of retaliation, and people with power and resources could be dangerous enemies, especially when they had nothing left to lose. The shooting range was nearly complete. Despite the delays and interference, we'd managed to create something I was genuinely proud of. A state-of-the-art facility with impeccable safety features, dedicated areas for different skill levels, and special programs for veterans and first responders. The grand opening was scheduled for that Sunday, and the response had been overwhelming, with people coming from neighboring counties to show support. Even some former critics had come around after seeing the professionalism and community focus of the operation. I should have been solely focused on final preparations, but Sheriff Thompson's warning kept nagging at me. Victoria had been suspiciously quiet since the town hall meeting 2 weeks ago, and that silence worried me more than her previous attacks. My concern proved justified when Ryan called late Thursday night. "Mason, someone tried to access the range site. Motion sensors picked them up near the equipment shed." I was in my truck before he finished speaking, calling Sheriff Thompson on the way. When I arrived, Thompson was already there with 2 deputies, examining fresh tire tracks and footprints around the perimeter. "At least 3 people," he said grimly. They were spooked by the security system before they could do any real damage. But they left this. He handed me a crumpled note that had been weighted down with a rock near the main building. The message was simple but chilling. Sunday won't happen. I'm staying here tonight, I told Thompson, and tomorrow we're setting up surveillance on all access points. He nodded in agreement. I'll have patrols drive by regularly, but I can't post someone here permanently. Not without more evidence. After he left, I called Alina to update her and then settled in for a long night. My old military training kicking in as I established a watch position with good visibility. Around 2 a.m., headlights appeared on the access road, moving slowly with no running lights. I stayed hidden, recording with my phone as 3 figures emerged from a black SUV with no plates. Even in the darkness, I recognized Victoria's distinctive silhouette directing the other 2 men who carried what looked like gas cans. I had a choice to make: confront them directly or gather evidence and let law enforcement handle it. The soldier in me wanted immediate action, but the strategist knew that catching them red-handed with proper witnesses would end this definitively. I texted Thompson with my location and a brief description, then continued recording. As the 3 approached the main building, they were methodical, pouring liquid around a foundation and discussing where to place something they called the package. I heard Victoria say clearly, "Make sure it looks like an accident, faulty wiring or something. Insurance won't pay if it's obvious." Sheriff Thompson's arrival was perfectly timed. Lights and sirens off, but multiple vehicles surrounding the property before Victoria and her accomplices knew what was happening. "Police, freeze where you are." The 2 men immediately dropped the gas cans and raised their hands. But Victoria made a dash for the SUV. She didn't get far before a deputy intercepted her. As Thompson read them their rights, Victoria's eyes found me, emerging from my hiding spot, phone still recording. The hatred in her expression was palpable, but beneath it was something else: disbelief that she'd finally faced consequences for her actions. The aftermath unfolded quickly. Victoria and her hired men were charged with attempted arson, criminal trespassing, and conspiracy. The investigation uncovered that one of the men was a former employee of Harrington Estates with a record of doing Victoria's dirty work. Richard filed for divorce the following day, publicly distancing himself from his wife's actions, while cooperating fully with authorities to reduce his own legal exposure. Financial records revealed Victoria had indeed been siphoning company assets into personal accounts, preparing for a worst-case scenario that had now arrived. Despite the drama, or perhaps because of it, the grand opening of Caldwell Tactical Range proceeded as planned that Sunday. The turnout was bigger than I could have imagined. Veterans, law enforcement, families, and neighbors all came to show support. Michael Chen gave a short speech about community resilience and the importance of standing up to bullying and corruption. Alina was there too, looking satisfied, but cautioning that the legal proceedings against Victoria would likely be lengthy and complex. "She has resources and connections," she reminded me. "This will take time." In the weeks that followed, the community began healing from Victoria's toxic influence. The reformed HOA, led by Michael, started revising bylaws to prevent future abuses. The county launched investigations into other Harrington Estates projects, uncovering multiple instances of environmental violations and permit irregularities. Richard, in a bid to salvage what he could of his reputation and business, offered to establish a community trust to protect the aquifer, ensuring it would benefit everyone, not just developers. It wasn't altruism, it was calculated damage control, but the result was still a win for the community. As for me, I found an unexpected peace in the resolution. The range became not just a business, but a gathering place, especially for veterans who found camaraderie and purpose there. The HOA notices stopped coming, and the fines were invalidated when it was proven they resulted from Victoria's manipulated bylaws. My grandfather's land remained intact, his legacy honored in a way I think would have made him proud. There was a certain poetry to it all. Victoria had tried to drive me out because of who I was and what I stood for, but those very qualities had ultimately been her undoing. The final chapter came 6 months later, when Victoria's case went to trial. I testified about the pattern of harassment, the threats, and finally, the attempted arson. Elena presented our meticulously gathered evidence, now supplemented by official investigations. Richard testified against his soon-to-be ex-wife, confirming her obsession with acquiring my land and controlling the aquifer. Throughout it all, Victoria sat stone-faced, her designer clothes replaced by modest business attire, her imperious demeanor diminished but not entirely gone. The verdict surprised no one, guilty on all counts. The judge, clearly unimpressed by Victoria's attempts to portray herself as a community-minded leader led astray by overzealousness, imposed a suspended sentence contingent on substantial community service and financial restitution. "Mrs. Harrington," he said during sentencing, "your actions showed a profound disrespect for the law, for your community, and for the rights of others. You weaponized an organization meant to bring neighbors together and used it to bully and intimidate those who stood in your way. The court cannot overlook such abuses of power." I declined to pursue additional civil damages, on one condition. Victoria would contribute significantly to a fund supporting local veterans' housing initiatives. It seemed fitting that her attempts to drive me from my home would result in helping others secure theirs. She agreed through gritted teeth, likely calculating that the alternative would be worse. As she left the courthouse that day, surrounded by reporters but abandoned by former allies, I felt no triumph, just relief that justice had prevailed and a community had reclaimed its voice. Today, Lakeside Estates is a different place. The reformed HOA focuses on genuine community needs rather than aesthetic micromanagement. The Caldwell Tactical Range thrives, offering safety courses, veterans programs, and community events. The resort development was redesigned as a more modest project that respects environmental concerns and water rights. And every Sunday morning, if you listen carefully, you can hear the sound of freedom echoing across the lake. Not to antagonize, but as a reminder that standing your ground matters. Victoria hated the sound of freedom, those gunshots from my range. Now she gets to enjoy the sound of defeat, the gavel in the courtroom. Ironically, her property was auctioned to pay restitution for just 1/10 of its market value. The buyer, a nonprofit veteran support organization I founded. Perhaps karma isn't just a concept, but a very loud reality. If there's one lesson in